So I guess we'll get started. Hi everyone, my name is Andrea Morden. I'm a research assistant at McGill University in Montreal in the Ricciardi lab. And today we'll be talking about how plastics in our waterways pose risk to wildlife. And so I am a microplastics project manager here in the Ricciardi lab. This means that I support microplastics research, both being conducted by Professor Ricciardi as well as by our graduate and undergraduate students here in our lab. And I've also been involved in microplastic outreach and policy development with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And this work has also been supported by the Canadian Wildlife Federation as well as by the Trottier Institute for Science and Public Policy here at McGill University. So as many of you know, plastic waste ends up in our lakes, rivers, and oceans and can pose serious risks to wildlife. So here we have a little sea lion and a turtle, and they can be entangled or consume plastic litter, and this can cause some pretty significant impacts. And the problem is only getting worse. So the United Nations Environmental Program says that our global plastic consumption is increasing by 5% every year. And most of that plastic is not being recycled. So in the United States alone, 6.5% of plastic is recycled, an additional approximately 8% is incinerated, but the rest of it all goes to landfills or ends up getting into our environment via litter. And even if we put plastic waste in the garbage, sometimes garbage is not managed as well as it could be, and we experience loss, and this can also get into our waterways. And plastic takes a long time to break down. It can take thousands and thousands of years for plastic to disintegrate. And so as our plastic consumption increases and the amount that's getting to the environment goes up, we see an accumulation of plastic in our waterways. And many of you might have heard about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and some of the other oceanic gyres full of plastic that scientists have discovered in recent years. This is one example of some of the big plastic pollution that we see in our systems, the water bottles and plastic bags that we find in the oceans and wash up on our beaches. But we also are starting to find very, very small plastic pollution. And if you look to the webcam, I'm showing you some right now. These are little microspheres. And it might be hard to see, but they're basically little tiny balls of plastic. These are called microplastics, and these are going to be the main focus of my talk today. So microplastics are any piece of plastic that is less than 5 millimeters in length or diameter. They can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. They might be beads or fibers or fragments, and they might be made of polyethylene, polypropylene, PVC, synthetic fibers, etc. So there's many, many different kinds. And they come from a variety of sources. One of the more significant sources is microfibers. And we have a new participant, Laura Coriel. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in, Laura. It's great to have you here. So as the synthetic clothing that we wear is washed, it can emit these little pieces of plastic called microfibers. And that's one thing that we're concerned about. Big plastic objects, or macroplastic pollution is what we call them, can also break down into smaller pieces of microplastic. These are plastic nurdles, the picture here that I've just shown you. These are basically small pellets of plastic resin. This is the raw form of plastic. And this is what is shipped to manufacturing facilities in order to create other plastic products. This is actually one of the more common types of microplastic pollution in Lake Huron. We also use plastic microspheres for a variety of applications, including in biotechnology. So right here, these paramagnetic microspheres I'm showing you are used in cell separation applications and other sorts of biotechnological applications. And finally, one of the more common sources of microplastics that we've been made aware of that you hear a lot about in the news lately is microplastics in personal care products. So this would be body scrubs, face scrubs, toothpastes that contain little pieces of plastics that are used as exfoliants. There's many ways that these plastics can get into our waterways and harm wildlife. First is wastewater treatment plants. Even though the data suggests that wastewater treatment plants retain most of the plastic that goes through them, either down our drains from our clothing or from our face scrubs, they can still emit millions up to billions of particles a day, depending on how much water they're treating and the population area they service. The breakdown of plastic litter is also a big source. So when a water bottle or a plastic bag ends up in our waterways, with wave action and sunlight, they eventually break down into smaller and smaller pieces and enter the microplastic size range, where they start interacting differently with wildlife compared to what we see when we see animals entangled in plastic bags or in the rings of beer cans and that kind of thing. Industrial plastic spills and emissions are another significant source. So the plastic nurdles I showed you earlier, those are transported by rail and by train to different facilities. And if there's a spill, even if the best efforts are made to clean them up, they can be very challenging to clean because they're so small. And then they can run off into our waterways when the rain falls, with the rest of the runoff. And also many of these facilities emit wastewater directly into our water bodies, just like our wastewater treatment plants, and they might also contain different types of microplastic pollution. Even if our wastewater treatment plants are able to skim off microplastics that are going through those facilities, if solid waste is collected and then put on agricultural fields, this can be another way that microplastics are introduced to our waterways. So when it rains and when that solid waste is run off into waterways, this can carry the microfibers and microplastics with them. And finally, another source that we're just starting to understand is atmospheric deposition. So what this means is that particularly in urban areas, where there are lots of people wearing lots of synthetic clothing and using lots of synthetic products, microfibers are taken up into the air by turbulent air in urban centers and then might be deposited in nearby lakes and rivers. So there's many pathways that plastics can take to get into our waterways, particularly microplastics. So I'm sure you guys can appreciate how challenging it's going to be to manage this type of pollution coming from all these different sources. So microplastics were first discovered in the Great Lakes, or it was first reported in the Great Lakes back in 2012, 2013, and are now known to be in all through the Great Lakes, in the surface water, in the sediments, and up on the beaches. They've also been found in Canada's coastal and marine waters. So we know that they are contaminating Halifax Harbour, and they're being taken up by invertebrates that live in Halifax Harbour. And they've also been found offshore Vancouver Island. They've even been detected in Arctic sea ice. And so basically when ice forms, it skims plastic off the surface water and then traps it in the ice structure. And then when that ice starts to melt, as we are expecting with climate change, we're expecting more and more sea ice to be melting, then that might become an additional source of microplastic pollution. But as we have just started studying this problem, we really don't understand the full extent of the problem in Canada yet. We know that they're in the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River and in certain marine and coastal waters, but most places just haven't been sampled for them. And what we have learned is that most places where we look for microplastics, we find them. So this does seem to be a really prevalent problem in our waterways. So in 2012, researchers in our lab were sampling at Bécancour, Quebec, which is the location is highlighted in black on the map. This is a site along the St. Lawrence River. And they were sampling for invertebrates. And they started finding a whole bunch of really small spheres in their samples. And at around the same time, reports started coming out of the Great Lakes region about microplastics being found in their water samples. And so in 2013, a crew from our lab went back and sampled from Lac Saint-François near the island of Montreal, all the way downstream to Quebec City. And at 8 out of those 10 sites, we found microplastics in the sediments. And at Bécancour, which had the highest density of pollution, microplastic pollution, they found on average 13,500 microplastics per meter squared. So these are really high densities. These densities approach some of the more contaminated marine systems. So the scale of the pollution is really significant in these systems. This problem isn't just limited to Canada either. This is data from Scientists and Adventurers for Conservation. It's a citizen science group, and they basically allow people around the world to send in water samples to be processed for microplastics. Every orange circle on this map shows the location of a water sample that tested positive for microplastic pollution, with the size of the circle indicating the density of the pollution. So this really shows the scale of the problem. There's no ocean or corner of the world really that seems to be untouched. Many of these locations where we don't see samples is likely due to lack of sampling effort rather than because there's no yellow circles either, which are the negative samples. We find them in the high Arctic and the Antarctic, through Central and South America, through waterways in North America, and even in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So what we're really concerned about are impacts to wildlife. And we do know that animals are consuming this type of pollution. They've been found in the gut tracts of fish and taken up by filter feeding invertebrates. On the left, we see a picture of a zooplankton that has consumed microbeads it was exposed to in an experiment. And on the right, these are 2 microbeads that a student in our lab removed from a yellow perch from the St. Lawrence River from its stomach. And so we know that they're taking them up. Now, does this cause any impacts? We're not sure yet. We're still studying that. We suspect that the plastics themselves, depending on their shape, might irritate or block the gut tract, also depending on the size of the organism. And they might also give a false feeling of fullness to the animal so that they might not eat as many nutritious food items, and this could have an impact on their health. We also know that when these smaller animals eat microplastics and then they are consumed by animals higher up in the food chain, that we get a bioaccumulation effect. So when invertebrates eat microplastics, fish eat the invertebrates, bigger fish eat the littler fish, and then all the way up the chain to seals and toothed whales that are consuming larger fish, we find an accumulation of plastics at the higher levels. And this is really concerning because this could also cause effects to those higher level organisms, particularly through the transfer of pollutants, which I'll get into in a second. But this is a really active area of research. We still haven't fully grasped the extent to which microplastics affect wildlife that consume them or that live in environments that are contaminated with them. But this paper that I've just shown you the headline for came out 2 weeks ago in Science magazine, and they showed that Eurasian perch that were hatched and reared in tanks containing polystyrene microplastics had lower hatching rates, had lower growth rates, had lower predator avoidance success. And so this really seems to suggest that when environments are contaminated with this type of pollution, it affects the animals that live there. So one reason we're really concerned about microplastics moving through food webs is their ability to transfer and concentrate persistent organic pollutants, POPs. So POPs are a specific type of chemical pollutant, and they can include some pesticides, some polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PCBs, and pharmaceuticals. These are particular types of pollutants that are hydrophobic, which means they don't like water, they don't like mixing in water due to their chemical structure. So they look for any surface that they can that's more favorable to them, that's not like water. And a microplastic fits the bill. So when a microplastic is in these waterways, these chemical pollutants that are really repelled by water are attracted to their surface. So as they move through a waterway, they can accumulate chemicals on their surface. These little gray circles in the diagram here represent microplastics once they're introduced to an aquatic system, and they can take up or release these contaminants. Then they might be consumed by invertebrates in the sediments or in the water column, and then those organisms might be consumed by higher level fish all the way up the food chain until they're consumed by top level consumers like humans or waterfowl. And at each step in this transfer, POPs have the opportunity to be absorbed by the body of the organism that has eaten it. And this potentially could cause some serious health effects, things like interrupted reproduction, cancer. But again, this is an active area of research. So we know that all the pieces of the puzzle are here. We know that POPs absorb POPs. We know that microplastics absorb POPs. We know that they are consumed by fish and that they transfer through the food web. But we're not sure yet if the POPs are accumulating through the food web, and we don't know if this is a significant source of POP exposure compared to the other pathways of POP exposure. So again, this is an active area of research, but something that we're really concerned about. And again, we're at the top of the food chain, and so we tend to eat a lot of the fish and shellfish that are known to be contaminated with microplastics. They've also been found in table salt and honey and beer. And so they're really common in our food systems, and they're likely to remain there for years to come. But we're really not sure about what impacts they pose to human health. So more research needs to be done in this area. The great news is that there's been a strong public response since this research has started coming out in the last 2 or 3 years. So more and more newspaper articles have been writing stories about this. Organizations like the Canadian Wildlife Federation have been making the public more aware of this problem. And this has led to some legislative responses. So the Canadian government is in the process of listing cosmetic microbeads as a toxic substance under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And the American government passed the Microbead Free Waters Act in December of last year. Both of these acts ban the manufacture, sale, distribution of personal cosmetic products that contain microplastics. So if you see the word polyethylene on this label, these are the little tiny spheres of plastic that we find in these products. But as we discussed earlier, this isn't the only form of microplastic pollution. There's many other different forms, and there's also many other products beyond personal care products that contain microplastics. And none of these legislative efforts address that. So this really is only the tip of the iceberg, and more work needs to be done. So our next steps as a research lab is we will continue to study microplastic pollution in the St. Lawrence River by quantifying its distribution, its abundance, start to get an idea of the diversity of microplastics that we're finding, and maybe trace back to some sources. We also want to explore if and how microplastics are being consumed by wildlife, including fish, and if that's causing any impacts. And finally, we are hoping to develop more effective monitoring methods to track the accumulation of microplastics in this system so that we can evaluate whether or not legislative efforts are effective. And there's lots that we can all do to help just in our daily lives. So the first thing is to not use personal care products containing microbeads. So look for the word polyethylene or polypropylene on the label. There are some scrubbing products that use natural abrasives. Certain products use walnut shells or cornmeal as an abrasive ingredient, but if they have those words, polyethylene or polypropylene, it's a good idea not to use it. Legislation is addressing these types of products, but it probably won't come into effect until 2017 or 2018, depending on your jurisdiction. It's also good to avoid non-natural textiles that produce microfibers. This is really challenging, especially for women, because so much of women's clothing now is made exclusively with synthetic materials or with synthetic natural blends. But it's something to keep in mind on your next shopping trip, to take a look at the label, look for the words polyester, rayon, and nylon, and then think about, whether you really need that new shirt or whether it's worthwhile to look for a cotton or linen one or something else made with a natural fiber. We can also try to reduce our plastic consumption. Even when we do our best to recycle our plastic goods, the general consumption of plastic creates more opportunity for plastic to be accidentally released or unintentionally released and contaminate our environment. It's also important to pick up litter. We've been all talking about this since we were little, the importance of litter pickups. And this is just another reason why we should be doing this type of activity. So next time you go on a walk with your dog or go hiking with your friends, just take a bag, take a gardening glove if you have one, and pick up the litter you see, particularly plastic, because once that plastic makes its way into waterways and starts breaking down into microplastics, there's very little we can do to get that back out again. So prevention really is the key in this situation. And finally, talk to your friends and family about microplastic pollution. It's a really important issue, and the more people who know about this, the more we can collectively make lifestyle decisions that will help reduce the severity of this problem. And you can also learn more from the Canadian Wildlife Federation if you're interested. The CWF has been supporting this work, and they've also featured plastic as their theme of Rivers to Oceans Week, which was the past week. So today's the last day of Rivers to Oceans Week. You can go to riverstooceans.ca to learn more about plastic, both in marine and freshwater systems, how plastic is harming wildlife and potentially harming humans. You can also do some cool activities, including calculate your plastic footprint. So I'm sure some of you have already calculated your carbon footprint online before to see how you might be contributing to climate change and where you can do better to reduce your carbon emissions. And this is a similar plastic footprint. So you can see how much plastic you're using, and you can also get some useful tips on how to reduce the amount of plastic that you use at home and in your personal life. And that's about it for now. I really thank you all for tuning in and for listening. And I'd like to thank the Canadian Wildlife Federation for supporting this work, as well as McGill University and the Trottier Institute for Science and Public Policy. And I'd be happy to take your questions. So thanks very much. And I guess you can pose questions in the chat, or maybe Melissa can help mediate this. Anyways, I'll stay online for another 10 or 15 minutes or so, and I can just answer questions as they come in. But thanks very much.
Thank you for that, Andrea. That was really interesting. If anybody has questions, like Andrea said, you can type them in the chat, or you can virtually raise your hand and we can enable your microphone if you like.
I see some typing.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Antonina. Hi, Andrea. Thank you for the talk. Or I guess you guys can all see it. I was wondering which POPs are considered the most dangerous to the environment. Oh, that's a great question from Yelena. That's a tricky question. It depends on what organism you are most interested in. And I might just ask, Melissa, is it possible for you to disable your microphone? Because I'm getting a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. Just hearing myself 5 seconds later. So the POPs that we're concerned with can cause a variety of impacts. So, for example, pharmaceutical products. Some recent work has shown that certain pharmaceutical products that accumulate in organisms can affect the sex of the animals as well as the reproductive success. PCBs and other types of POPs can increase cancer rates. So it really depends on the impact that you're concerned about. But I personally would say that all POPs are dangerous to the environment because the reason they're called persistent organic pollutants is that they persist in the environment for a long time. There's not much we can do to get them out. So PCBs were actually banned many, many years ago because of their behavior as a POP, and they're no longer found in products. However, we're still finding them accumulating in organisms because they never go away. And so I guess the short answer to your question is that it's like picking or choosing your favorite child. I can't pick or choose the more dangerous POP. They all, in a certain capacity, can cause effects that we need to be concerned about. Thanks. Another great question from Amy. So when did it become recognized that microplastics were a problem? We've been talking about plastic pollution and microplastic pollution mostly in marine systems since the early 1990s. But it really didn't come into the public eye until the last 10 years, just due to the sheer accumulation of plastics. The state of our oceans has changed dramatically in the last 15 years. We've seen a large accumulation of plastic, and it started coming to the public eye at that point. Microplastic has always kind of been something that was, there was a lag between when we started noticing plastic pollution and when we started noticing microplastic pollution, because we have to look a bit more closely for it. But in marine systems, yeah, we noticed it in the early 1990s. Research really started in the early 2000s. But for freshwater systems, for lakes and rivers all around the world, the problem really wasn't discussed until 5 years ago. And this is because for a long time it was believed that because plastic is buoyant, it would be emitted in cities along lakes and rivers, but it would just float out into the oceans where it would accumulate in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and other plastic or waste gyres. But what we're starting to find now is that when plastic is introduced to freshwater systems, they accumulate a biofilm. So this is like a layer of bacteria that grows around the surface of the microplastic that makes it heavier. And this is what eventually causes the microplastic to sink. So instead of thinking of lakes and rivers as highways for microplastic pollution into our oceans, they're actually sinks where plastic accumulates. And this distinction was really only made a couple of years ago. So this is very new field. And this is why we still have so much work to do, because we really just started looking at this since the beginning of 2011. Thanks. Any more questions? I'm happy to take them. We have another question from Michaela. So she's seen many new revolutionary ocean cleaning systems that researchers and students have designed. Do you know if any of these are working or will work to help reduce the plastic in the ocean? That's a great question. I think some of these new skimming and filtering technologies are really promising, and they're really great to help deal with some of the macro plastic pollution that we're seeing, the bigger plastic pieces. And that's an important thing to address because they cause significant environmental effects as well, and eventually break down into microplastics. The one concern that I have as a biologist is that we do find that plastics become structure in a system where there's very little structure. So if you're out in the open ocean and you've got a big mass of garbage and plastic bottles all floating at the surface, those structures, believe it or not, actually attract fish and attract invertebrates that use those structures to hide from predators and whatnot, even though they're also causing negative effects. So what my first concern would be to make sure that when we're using these technologies, we design them in such a way that we reduce the amount of wildlife that we're also skimming out of the water. And there's ways that we can do this, just something to be aware of when we're designing these technologies. Because I don't think it would be necessarily good for wildlife in the ocean to be scooped up with the rest of the plastic we're trying to get rid of. At the end of the day, when we're looking at mitigation technologies, we should always weigh the effects of the pollution or the negative environmental stressor with the effects of using the technology to mitigate that stressor. But I think they're really promising, and I'm excited to see what directions those go in. Now, whether they are effective on microplastic pollution, I haven't seen yet of any technology that addresses microplastics in particular once they're in aquatic systems. We can use technology to prevent them from going into systems to try to reduce the output, but once they're in our waterways, I haven't seen any technology that would be able to address plastics in that size range. Thanks for the great question, Michaela. So any more questions? I thought I saw some typing going on. But if there isn't, then I guess I'll give you people a second to get out their last question if they have one. And it seems like no one's typing, so thanks very much to the Canadian Wildlife Federation for facilitating this.
Sorry for the feedback. We just unmuted our microphone to say thank you to you, Andrea, as well. Thank you very much for this presentation.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much for facilitating it. And thanks to all the participants for calling in.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Okay, sounds good.